Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we start a journey not into the darkness that came with the plague, but into the strange, echoing dawn that followed it. You're not a king or a bishop, you're a survivor. You're breathing air that has suddenly become lighter, thinner, and full of unnerving possibility. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the field outside your small, smoke-stained cottage. Just a year ago you would have heard the constant, ragged rhythm of the village, the far-off clang of the smithy, the harsh commands of the bailiff, the endless shouts of children, and most of all the rhythmic scraping of dozens of hoes and the slow, heavy bellows of oxen. Now, the sound that defines your life is the deep, unsettling quiet. That quiet is the sound of an entire generation vanishing. It's the silence of a village that, just months ago, held maybe 300 souls, and now holds perhaps 80. You walk out to your meagre acreage, and where your neighbour, old Thomas, used to trudge, sweating and cursing, under the weight of his lord's required labour, there is nothing. Thomas is gone. His whole family is gone. You look across the open fields, the strips of arable land that have been worked and reworked for centuries, and you see something utterly foreign, empty strips. Weeds are already starting their insolent climb, reclaiming the good soil. It's a vivid, unsettling picture. You're surrounded by rich black earth, but your hands are too few to harvest it all. It is a bounty that feels like a curse, because the price of this bounty was too high. You probably won't survive this, not because of the disease, but because the sheer, sudden change in the world is going to tear apart every rule you've ever known. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, tell me where you are and what time it is for you in the comments. I love knowing we're sharing this quiet moment across time and space. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of the abandoned field, the late afternoon sun casting long skeletal shadows of the tall weeds, the fear of the pestilence itself, the ghastly swellings, the fever, the quick, inevitable end, has started to recede, replaced by a deep, economic terror. You're alive, but you have no certainty. Your world was built on overpopulation, on too many people chasing too few resources, which kept your wages low and your lord's power absolute. Now, that entire equation has flipped, and you're living in a bizarre, unstable, inverse world. The immediate problem is simple arithmetic. Before the Black Death swept through in the mid-14th century, the ratio of land to labour was heavily skewed against you. A feudal lord held vast tracts, and a massive population was always available to work it, ensuring that labour was cheap and compliance was mandatory. The plague killed between a third and a half of Europe's population, an established mainstream historical fact that fundamentally rewired the continent's operating system. Think of it. 40% of the world's workers simply vanished. The physical land is still there, the tools are still there, the sheep are still bleating, but the hands to plant, shear and hammer are gone. Your personal story revolves around your small family, your wife, perhaps 2 surviving children and yourself. That is your entire workforce. You have the right to farm your own family's traditional strips, of course, the ones granted to you under the manorial system. But look to the north. Those fields belong to the Cooper family. To the west, the fields of the Millers. Both families were entirely wiped out. Under the old law, those fields should automatically revert to the Lord of the Manor. But the Lord of the Manor, Baron Reginald, well, he lost his own steward, his bailiff, and 3 of his 4 ploughmen. Baron Reginald is in fact spending most of his time locked in his solar, terrified of a new outbreak, and he certainly isn't in a hurry to personally supervise the tilling of every empty strip of land in the parish. This gap, this vacuum of authority and labour, is your first great opportunity. The quirky tidbit here, a fringe detail that shows the depth of the collapse, is the sheer number of abandoned animals. In the immediate aftermath, thousands of pigs, cattle and sheep were simply roaming freely. The shepherds and drovers were dead, and the stock was left to wander. You, as a survivor, would have had the incredibly dangerous but necessary task of rounding up this feral livestock. Imagine trying to pen a cow that hasn't seen a human in 6 months. It's not a docile creature, it's practically wild, and it was a common practice for surviving villagers to pool resources just to hunt and secure these suddenly valuable, ownerless herds. This desperate impromptu livestock roundup was a financial windfall for those who dared to do it, converting death into sudden, massive capital. This leads us to the heart of the matter: land tenure. Who owns the empty land? The old system of feudalism dictated everything. It was a neat, hierarchical pyramid, and you were firmly on the bottom, but the plague didn't just kill people, it killed the chain of command. The lord is remote or dead, the bailiff is a corpse. The only people who know where the boundaries lie, where the good soil is and how to work it, are you and the handful of other survivors. You look at Thomas Cooper's strips. They are fertile. They are easily accessible. You know they haven't been sown. If you wait for Baron Reginald to formally redistribute them, you will wait until the next harvest is lost. So, you make a pragmatic, revolutionary decision. You quietly, cautiously, begin to work them. You yoke your surviving ox, your only major piece of capital, and you turn the soil on what is legally not yours. This act, this quiet, opportunistic expansion of your own holdings, is the true start of your new life. You're not asking permission, you're responding to a biological and economic imperative. Your survival requires you to break the old rules, and the beauty of it is that the authorities who should stop you are either dead or too busy managing their own estates that are collapsing. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was primarily a catalyst that merely sped up existing socio-economic trends, or a true rupture that created entirely new systems out of the wreckage. For you, it feels like a rupture. The sudden freedom to trespass, to expand, to act without immediate fear of the whip or the stocks is exhilarating. It's like the heavy, invisible ceiling of your life has been blown away. Your family's day-to-day existence is a mix of hard labour and perpetual uncertainty. You're now working twice the land with half the hands. The physical burden is immense, but the psychological burden is heavier. Every surviving person is now carrying the tasks of two. Your children, barely adolescents, are now indispensable farmhands, their childhood abruptly ending in the empty fields. There is no time for leisure, no time for the old village festivals. The May Day poles stand unadorned, the music is silent. Yet you sleep better than you used to. You're exhausted, true, but the exhaustion is different. It's the fatigue of a man working for himself, not entirely for his lord. You're sowing the seed of your own destiny into Thomas Cooper's old fields, and if you can bring in a bumper crop, that wealth is yours, not the Baron's. The calculation is simple. Risk a legal challenge later, or starve now. The risk is worth taking. The challenge now is not just farming the land, but defending your claim. The old communal system, where you all worked together and everyone knew their place, is breaking down. Those who survived are now rivals for the sudden surplus of everything: land, tools, and the few remaining skilled artisans. You eye your neighbours cautiously. Do they see you working Cooper's land? Are they planning to do the same to Miller's? The rules of community have been replaced by the rules of scarcity and opportunity. This is why you have to be clever. You don't just plough the land, you do something to mark it. Perhaps you find an old, forgotten boundary stone and move it a little, just a foot or two, to subtly incorporate the new strips into your recognised acreage. Perhaps you start storing your tools in Thomas Cooper's derelict shed, an act of slow, deliberate appropriation that transforms a legal trespass into a physical claim. The law is sluggish, but possession is 9/10 of the law, especially when the sheriff is too terrified to leave his house. Remember that pre-plague world? The one where your ancestors' life was dictated by the Lord's calendar, your every movement tracked? That world is in pieces. You're now a demographically valuable asset. This isn't just a new life, it's a terrifying promotion. You, the poor farmer, are suddenly in the economic driver's seat because labour is power. You're preparing for the next harvest, a harvest that could lift your family out of poverty for the first time in generations. But this new wealth is precarious. It rests on a fragile, temporary truce with authority. A truce born purely out of the incompetence and terror of the ruling class. You know they will eventually recover, they will reorganise, and they will try to put the lid back on the world. They will try to force you back into that box you've just crawled out of. But for now, under the strange empty sky, you plough on. You're turning the soil of an old manor, and what is rising in the furrow is not just wheat, but the first shoots of your family's economic freedom. You've planted the seeds in Thomas Cooper's field, and the heavy weight of that transgression now sits on your conscience like a stone. It's a risk, yes, but risk is the only currency you have left. The first few weeks after that initial audacious ploughing are a blur of hard work, fueled by a nervous energy. You are listening constantly, for the sound of hooves, for a raised voice, for the arrival of a messenger from the manor house demanding to know why you've dared to cross the boundary ditch. But the silence holds. The lord of the manor, Baron Reginald, remains preoccupied, and the machinery of feudal control is still sputtering. The reality you face now is that your opportunistic land grab needs to be solidified. It has to move from a quiet trespass to a recognised, if contested, claim. This is where the ghosts start to become a problem. You're not just farming land, you're dealing with legal ambiguity on a scale the medieval world has never encountered. Every dead person left a legal void, a bundle of rights and obligations that should have been neatly passed on, but the system of manorial records, the heart of medieval land ownership, is in chaos. Think about the process. To prove who owned what, the lord's clerk or scribe kept careful rolls, detailing the tenants, their rents, their services, and their inheritances. It was all recorded, usually on parchment, often in Latin, and almost always in the specific hand of a man who is now likely dead. Maybe the surviving clerk is illiterate. Maybe the entire chest of records was burned when the manor house was abandoned during the height of the epidemic. What you have is not a clear deed. You have local knowledge. This is your strength. You, the surviving villager, know every marker, every old oak, every boundary stream, and every verbal agreement that governed the land. You know Thomas Cooper had no direct heirs. You know the Millers only had a cousin living 3 shires away, and that cousin has no idea this land even exists. You are the living record, and this unwritten common knowledge suddenly carries enormous weight. The mainstream historical fact here is that the catastrophic loss of life caused a massive spike in intestacy, meaning people died without a valid will. The sheer speed of the plague meant entire families were wiped out in days, without time for a proper legal transfer of property. This created a legal and administrative nightmare, forcing manorial courts to accept testimony from surviving neighbours, from you, to figure out who, if anyone, should inherit. You are called before the hastily assembled and often terrified manorial court simply because you are one of the few who still remembers the lay of the land. You attend the court, perhaps in the Lord's barn, where the smells of straw and damp wood mix with the lingering odour of fear. You stand with 5 other survivors, the tailor, the new reeve, and 2 other farmers. The acting steward, a nervous man called John who used to be a stable hand, asks about Thomas Cooper's strips. You don't brazenly claim the land. Instead, you employ the age-old peasant art of legal ambiguity. "Well, sir," you say, bowing, "Thomas, may God rest his soul, had no one. His fields were always hard to manage, as you know. Since the harvest was upon us, and the good Christian soil shouldn't go to waste, I merely ploughed and sowed it to keep the weeds down and hold it in trust for the Lord until such time as a rightful heir might appear. You are framing your trespass as a dutiful temporary management, a noble act of stewardship. The nervous steward, John, has no interest in getting into a protracted legal battle, especially when he himself is barely keeping his own farm running. He sees a ready crop growing and an able-bodied man who's already done the hard work. This pragmatic reality often trumped the ancient legal right. The quirky tidbit that emerges from this era is the sudden importance of dead people's stuff. Land was primary, but chattels, tools, pots, simple furniture, even decent clothes, were incredibly valuable. Before the plague, when you died, the Lord often claimed the best item, Heriot. Now, entire homes are simply locked up full of goods. Villagers began the practice of covert salvage, quietly entering abandoned homes and borrowing necessities. Your wife might acquire 3 sturdy cooking pots that belonged to the Millers. You might end up with Thomas Cooper's best iron shovel. There was a temporary unspoken amnesty on petty theft of the deceased's property, because who exactly was going to prosecute it? A whole new class of goods entered circulation, acquired through the inheritance of silence. This raises a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the post-plague land consolidation, where survivors like you ended up farming much larger tracts, was primarily due to the legal transfers, albeit messy ones, of property, or simply squatting and de facto appropriation by those able to physically work the land. For you, the answer is a blend of both. You are squatting, but you're using the chaos in the legal system to legitimize your squatting. You're an economic opportunist wearing a thin cloak of piety. You realise that securing the land isn't just about farming it, it's about holding on to it in a way the Lord can't easily undo. You start consolidating your strips. The traditional medieval open field system was highly inefficient, with individual families farming dozens of narrow, scattered strips across the manor's massive fields. This was designed to ensure fairness, giving everyone a piece of good, bad, and medium soil. Now, with huge amounts of land abandoned, you begin to trade strips with your few remaining neighbours. I'll take your 3 strips by the river if you take my 5 scattered strips on the common field, you might negotiate with the surviving tailor, who has no desire to farm anyway. This leads to the early stages of field consolidation, pulling your family's land into larger, more manageable, and therefore more productive blocks. This is a tiny, local revolution in agricultural efficiency, driven entirely by the need to maximise the limited surviving labour. The other key part of securing your future is the legal document itself. If you are extremely lucky, John the Steward might agree to give you a copyhold, a formal document recorded on the manorial roll, which essentially gives you a copy of the court's entry, recognising your holding, your copy of the roll that you hold. Before the plague, these documents were rare and most peasants were villains, tenants at will who could be evicted easily. After the plague, the Lord's desperate need to secure any tenant, anyone willing to pay any rent, meant that a few fortunate survivors like you were able to press for a more secure, heritable tenancy. A copyhold, even a shaky one, means that if you die, your son inherits the land, not the Lord. It's a huge psychological and financial leap toward true economic freedom. Your family is transitioning from villenage, a form of near servitude, to a status closer to an independent yeoman farmer. The power has shifted because the Lord needs your labour more than you need his protection. If he treats you too harshly, you can simply pack up your few belongings and walk to the next empty manor, or perhaps one of the deserted medieval villages we'll talk about later, where a desperate new lord will gladly offer you even better terms. The ultimate joke here is that the entire manorial system was designed to keep you poor, landless and dependent, but the tiny, invisible organism of the plague tore the very fabric of that system apart. You are one of the threads that remained, and now you have the chance to reweave the cloth of society into something that suits you rather than the baron. You're using the tools of the aristocracy, their records, their courts, their law, to gain leverage over them. It's a delightful, slow-burn revenge orchestrated by bacteria. Your focus now shifts from simply surviving the disease to surviving the massive, violent economic correction it triggered. Your expanded, consolidated fields are the foundation. But to work them, you need labour, and the price of labour is about to become the single most contentious issue in the entire kingdom. The next phase of your life is not a quiet ploughing. It's a loud, angry negotiation. You have the land, now you must assert the value of your hands. You've secured the newly empty strips of land. The wheat is starting to push green shoots through the dark soil of Thomas Cooper's former farm. You have more acreage than your family can possibly work alone, and that is a problem, but it's a rich person's problem. For the first time in your lineage, you're not desperate for employment. You're the one offering it. You need help bringing in the expanded harvest, and this necessity propels you directly into the most radical, exhilarating economic shift of the Middle Ages, labour's golden age. Before the plague, if you needed extra hands for the planting or the arduous late summer reaping, you had no leverage. The Lord's bailiff could command every available man, woman and older child to work for the Lord first, often for no more than the customary fee, a pittance, maybe a small measure of grain, or just the expectation of avoiding a beating. The market was flooded with desperate, unskilled peasants. You were replaceable. You were cheap. Now, you are the employer, and the handful of surviving young, able-bodied men in the village, the few who didn't inherit enough land to be self-sufficient, are negotiating with you, and then they are negotiating with the 2 other surviving major farmers, and then they are negotiating with Baron Reginald himself. The tables have not just turned, they have been violently flung across the room. The mainstream historical fact that defines this era is the massive immediate wage inflation. Overnight, the value of the surviving worker soared. Where a farmhand might have earned a penny or 2 a day before the 1340s, you are now hearing demands of 4, 5, or even 6 pennies a day, often with food and ale thrown in. You gasp at the sheer insolence of the demand, but then you look at the lush, ripening fields that will rot without those hands, and you agree. You have to. You cannot afford to lose your new investment, and the labourer knows it. Imagine the conversation. Young William, who's barely 18, stands before you. Before the plague, he would have nervously tugged his forelock and accepted whatever meagre sum you offered. Now he leans against your fence post, chewing on a piece of straw, looking you dead in the eye. "Master," he says, using the term with just the faintest hint of irony, "I'll help with the reaping, but I want 6pence a day, good white bread, and ale with every meal. And I finish when the light is gone, not when your back decides it's time to rest. 6pence. That's more than some men earned in a week before the plague. But you swallow your pride and shake his hand. You are paying a high price, but you are buying freedom from the old system. The wages come from the profit of your expanded, appropriated fields, not from the meagre income of your traditional holding. This is capitalism's ugly, beautiful birth pangs. You are using newfound capital, land, to leverage market opportunity, scarcity of labour. The freedom, however, extends beyond just high wages. It encompasses the right to refuse. Before, refusal meant punishment, possibly starvation. Now, if Baron Reginald, who is still nursing his aristocratic pride, offers William 5pence, William can simply say, "No, thank you, my lord. Master, your name is offering 6 and his ale is better." And the lord can do nothing but fume, because if he arrests William for insolence, he loses the chance to hire the only 3 hands left in the region. This is the power of a seller's market for labour. You, the surviving commoner, are suddenly the seller, and the lords are the desperate buyers. The quirky tidbit that illustrates this seismic shift is the appearance of the professional travelling artisan. Before the plague, most villagers relied on local, sometimes part-time craftsmen. Now you see specialised workers, masons, carpenters, and thatch masters, forming small, highly paid roving gangs. They move from manor to manor, demanding exorbitant fees, but performing expert work. Why? Because the surviving population, suddenly finding themselves with disposable income, all want to improve their homes, something we'll discuss later. You might have to pay a travelling roofer 3 times what you'd pay a local for patching your roof, but he does the job in a day, doesn't waste materials, and moves on, an independent contractor centuries before the term existed. Their mobility is their power, and they have no fealty to any local lord. This whole situation creates a dramatic psychological reversal. You realise that your personal worth is no longer tied to your social class, but to your economic utility. Your strong back, your knowledge of planting, your ability to mend a fence. These are the assets that matter, not your title or lack thereof. This new dynamic also leads to complex negotiations over tenancy terms. When a lord loses half his tenants, the manors are full of empty villain holdings. He is now competing with you, the successful farmer, and with other desperate lords to attract anyone who can farm. The terms they offer become astonishingly good. Lower rents. They may drop the annual rent from 10 shillings to 6 shillings, or switch from demanding produce to demanding cash, which is easier for you to manage. Abolition of corvée. The greatest freedom is the reduction, or outright abolition, of labour services corvée. Instead of having to work on the lord's domain, his private land, for 3 days a week, you might be asked for just a few days at harvest time, or none at all, replaced by a small extra cash payment. You're paying for your time, and your time is now yours. Hereditary security, copyhold. As we touched on, the lords are more willing to grant that secure, heritable copyhold status, formalising your move from a serf-like status to a free peasant. The lord is effectively forced to commodify labour. He can no longer demand it as a feudal right. He must purchase it as an economic necessity. And the high price of labour is simultaneously making the lord poorer, since he's paying high wages and getting low rents, and making you, the surviving tenant, far richer. This radical shift in power has led to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the demographic shock of the Black Death was the sole necessary condition for the breakdown of the manorial system, or if the system was already becoming economically unviable due to slow population growth and prior peasant resistance. For you, it feels like the system was viable, but the plague simply put a stick of dynamite under it. The prior resistance, like the scattered minor uprisings before 1347, was the spark, but the plague was the powder keg that caused the social structure to explode. You see the impact of this new reality not just in wages, but in how people carry themselves. The surviving peasants walk taller. They are more likely to argue back, to demand their rights, to take grievances to the courts. The fear is still there, yes, but it's tempered by the knowledge that they are indispensable. You even witness a local minor dispute that illustrates this. Old Farmer Giles, known for his grumbling, refuses to pay the traditional merchant, a fine paid to the lord for the right to marry off a daughter. The bailiff threatens him. Before the plague, Giles would have been instantly fined, jailed, or physically punished. Now Giles merely points to his fields, ready for the plough, and asks the bailiff, "And who exactly will bring in my crops if you take me to the stocks?" The bailiff, after a moment of frustrated silence, retreats. The unspoken threat of walking away is now the commoner's most powerful weapon. But this newfound power does not go unnoticed. The lords, accustomed to absolute authority, are not going to simply shrug and accept their fate as the newly impoverished gentry. They see their entire way of life crumbling because a few strong-willed labourers are asking for too much money. Their reaction is immediate, aggressive, and entirely predictable. They will try to use the law, the one tool they still firmly control, to turn the clock back. This brings us to the next act in your drama. The king's futile, furious attempt to halt the tide of economic freedom. You know this gold rush can't last without a fight. You've shaken hands with young William, agreeing to pay that outrageous 6pence a day for the harvest. You've swallowed the cost because you understand the new economic truth. The high price of labour is merely the cost of securing your family's expanded land and future wealth. But while you and William are negotiating this revolutionary wage on your newly acquired strips, far away in Westminster, the ruling class is having a collective meltdown. They see their entire social order, built on the cheap, expendable lives of people like you, evaporating in a puff of Black Death smoke. Their immediate furious response is to try and stop the clock. In 1351, just a couple of years after the worst of the plague had passed, King Edward III issued the Statute of Labourers. This is your mainstream historical fact for this section, and it is perhaps the single most important piece of legislation attempting to reverse the plague's social changes. It was a direct, panicked decree from the Crown designed to do one thing: force wages back down to pre-plague levels and compel every able-bodied person to accept employment. Imagine the text of the statute, read aloud by a nervous, pompous royal herald in the nearest market town. Its contents a blend of delusion and desperation. It declared that any labourer, artisan, or servant must accept the wages and conditions that prevailed in 1346 before the pestilence. It also included a clause against vagrancy, which is to say, walking away from your current awful lord, and fixed the price of food and tools. The aristocracy essentially tried to use a royal proclamation to cancel the basic laws of supply and demand. You stand there listening, a gentle, sarcastic smile playing on your lips. The king has commanded the economy to be what it no longer is. It's like demanding that water flow uphill. You think, the king can order a lot of things, but he can't order half the population back from the grave. This decree is a perfect example of the ruling class trying to legislate away a biological catastrophe. This is where your new power comes into play. The statute is the law of the land, but enforcing it requires local manpower. The very bailiffs, constables and jurors who are either dead or too busy trying to farm their own meagre holdings. The enforcement is sporadic, ineffective, and often corrupt. You see this in action immediately. Old Baron Reginald, invigorated by the king's order, sends his new, much less intimidating bailiff, a nervous man named Giles, to you. Giles demands that you only pay William the pre-plague wage of 2p. Ah, Giles, you say, leaning on your hoe, a fine law, certainly. But where are the men willing to work the king's fine wage? William. He walked to the next manor just this morning. Lord Fitzwilliam over the hill is offering 5p despite the king's word. If I don't match it, my crop rots. And if my crop rots, how will I pay the king's taxes? Perhaps you'd like to work for 2p, Giles. The hoe is right there. The sarcasm is subtle, delivered with a sleepy ASMR cadence, but the meaning is deadly serious. The bailiff is caught in a legal trap. He is legally required to enforce the low wage, but practically required to secure the harvest. If he strictly enforces the statute, the labour walks away, the fields lie fallow, and the baron, and thus the king, gets no rent or tax. The ingenious way people like you and William navigate this is through creative accounting and benefits in kind. You agree to pay William the legal 2p a day for his recorded wage, fulfilling the letter of the statute. but you then pay him another 4p a day as an expense allowance for his boots, or a gift for working on a holy day, or simply board and lodging that you drastically overvalue. This circumvention became so widespread that it's a fringe but important tidbit of this era. The actual high wages were often hidden in the manor records under a dizzying array of invented euphemisms, turning legal documents into deliberate fiction. You're essentially committing widespread low-level financial fraud, and everyone, except the king, is complicit because it's the only way to get the work done. This widespread civil disobedience highlights a crucial scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the failure of the Statute of Labourers was due more to its inherent unenforceability and the irresistible economic pressures, or if it was the result of a conscious, organised campaign of peasant non-compliance and resistance. For you, it feels like the economic pressure was the flood, and the peasant resistance was simply realising the dike had broken. You didn't organise a strike, you simply exercised your market value by walking away, and the system had no tool strong enough to chain you back down. The consequences of this resistance were significant. Though the statute ultimately failed to restore the pre-plague economy, the ruling class still tried to enforce it, leading to countless local court battles where labourers were fined for demanding too much, or for leaving their employer. But here's the kicker. The fines were usually low, and often the labourer simply paid the fine and immediately went back to the same employer who paid the high wage anyway. The fine became a minor, occasional cost of doing business, rather than a deterrent. Moreover, the statute had an unintended negative side effect for the lords. It enraged the common people, making them politically conscious of their own exploitation. Before, low wages were just the natural order. Now they were a specific unjust law passed by elites trying to steal back the economic freedom given by God, or more accurately by the plague. This anger smoulders, feeding a deep resentment against the ruling class that will explode in the future. You see your neighbouring farmer Thomas being dragged before the court for paying a carpenter too much. The carpenter, who had travelled 30 miles, simply refused to work for less. Thomas is fined 6 shillings. He pays it grumbling, then immediately tells the carpenter, "See? Now that the king is paid, let's get back to work. I'll pay you the agreed upon amount tonight, but please, let's keep the book simpler." The statute has simply introduced a new layer of inefficiency and antagonism into the economy. The ultimate joke in this scenario is that the lords and the king are so focused on labour wages that they miss the bigger picture, the massive unregulated expansion of peasant landholdings. While they are fussing over a few pennies, you are quietly working 3 times the land your father worked, laying the groundwork for multi-generational wealth accumulation. They are fighting the small battle of wages and losing the grand war of property ownership. You, the successful survivor, continue to exploit this chaos. You hire William, you pay him well, and you bring in your bumper harvest from your expanded fields. The harvest is a success, and you now have a surplus of grain, which means cash. This cash allows you to make your next great leap, escaping the tyranny of a dilapidated home and finally upgrading your standard of living, something that would have been impossible a decade ago. But first, you look beyond the village and consider a major relocation, driven by the same force of opportunity, the lure of the empty landscape. The king's frustrated law may try to tie you down, but the economic pull of greener, emptier pastures is too strong to resist. You begin to gaze at the places the plague destroyed utterly, the DMVS, and wonder if freedom and anonymity are worth living among the ghosts. The Statute of Labourers is toothless against the sheer economic gravity pulling you toward better opportunities. You brought in your expanded harvest and now your barn is full of your own grain, not the baron's. The money is good, but the land, even the land you've appropriated, still comes with the heavy baggage of the manorial system. You're still subject to the residual authority of Baron Reginald, still tied to the old tithing and the old ways. As the quiet of winter settles, you begin to gaze at the wider map of the Shire. The plague did not strike evenly. Some villages were merely shrunken, losing 1/3 of their people, like yours. But others were hit with total mortality, every single inhabitant wiped out. These places, the deserted medieval villages, are the ultimate signposts of your new empty world. For you, the successful, ambitious survivor, they represent the ultimate freedom, a fresh start, a life with no lord, no bailiff, and no history of servitude. You decide to make the journey. You saddle your aging horse, which, by the way, you inherited from a deceased neighbour, another ghost inheritance, and you ride a day's journey to the nearest known DMV, a place called Aylesford, perhaps 10 miles away. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Black Death is the primary event that created the vast majority of DMVS across northern Europe. While some villages were abandoned before the plague due to things like local economic shifts or warfare, the mid-14th century saw a massive, simultaneous wave of village disappearance. In England alone, hundreds of villages vanished entirely. These were not just empty fields, they were physical ruins that remained visible for centuries, humps and hollows in the landscape marking where homes, streets and the parish church once stood. When you arrive at Aylesford, the sight is chilling. The main street is gone, replaced by a grassy track. The timber-framed houses have mostly rotted away or been cannibalised for firewood by opportunistic travellers, but the stone foundations remain, tracing the ghostly outlines of former lives. Most dramatically, the parish church still stands, roofless and skeletal, a monument to a piety that failed to save its congregation. As you walk among the ruins, you feel the eerie presence of the ghosts. The land itself is strangely fertile, having rested for years, but the emotional and practical difficulties of resettling such a place are immense. First, there is the supernatural fear. People in the medieval world believed in ghosts, revenants, the walking dead, and lingering evil spirits. To live in a place where an entire community died simultaneously was considered deeply dangerous. A place where the veil between the worlds was thin. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit of the section. Many DMVS were left abandoned for decades not because the land was bad, but because of the deeply ingrained cultural fear of the dead. Local folklore often prohibited taking stones or timber from these sites, lest the spirits follow you home. You find yourself whispering prayers and making the sign of the cross far more often than you would back in your home village. Second, there is the legal vacuum. Who owns Aylesford? Technically, it reverted to the lord of the manor if he exists, but the manor itself might have been split up, or its title unclear. A key incentive for moving is the hope of establishing squatters' rights, or finding a lord so desperate for a rental income that they'll grant a very favourable copyhold tenancy. You know that if you can endure the ghosts, you might be able to start a new manor, free of all the old customs and feudal dues that oppress your home village. You look at the empty fields. This is perfect, consolidated land. There are no narrow strips here. You could simply divide the fields into large, efficient tracts. This possibility of agricultural re-engineering is incredibly tempting. Imagine ploughing a field not a dozen narrow times, but once, in a smooth, continuous line. The efficiency alone promises a huge boost in productivity. You spend the afternoon inspecting the remains. You note the deep ditch that surrounded the village, the small pond for watering livestock, and the outlines of the old farmyard. You even find a beautifully carved but discarded grindstone, a piece of capital you couldn't afford a year ago. The decision to migrate is not just about farming, it's about social mobility. Moving to a DMV means escaping your social pigeonhole. You're no longer just the son of old Farmer John, you're a pioneer, a founder of a new settlement. This is the chance to become a freeholder, a man who owns his land outright rather than a tenant. The opportunity is immense, but the challenge is terrifying. You would have to rebuild everything from scratch: a home, a barn, a well, and a new life. This entire phenomenon leads to a classic scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the long-term abandonment of DMVS should be viewed as an economic failure. The land was inherently poor or unsustainable, or as a deliberate social choice made by peasants who had simply gained enough power and freedom to move to better, more consolidated land elsewhere. For you, standing there in the ruins, it feels like a glorious choice. The land is good, but the power to choose where to live is the new luxury of the survivor. Ultimately, you return home with mixed feelings. Aylesford is a potent symbol of opportunity, but it's too solitary, too haunted. You realise that while you crave freedom, you also crave the support of a surviving community, the shared defence and the social interaction. You decide that the better path is to stay in your existing village, leveraging your expanded land holdings and your newfound labour power to transform your life from within the existing structure. Using the threats and opportunities of the DMV to keep Baron Reginald nervous, you hold the possibility of walking away, of becoming an economic refugee, as a silent weapon against his authority. Your attention now turns to the practicalities of your success. Your wages and crop surpluses are building a small pile of cash in a pot buried beneath your floorboards. But while your income has soared, you quickly discover that the economic chaos of the post-plague world has a dark flip side. The prices of goods are rising just as quickly, threatening to devour your newfound wealth. The scarcity that gave you power as a labourer is about to hit you hard as a consumer. You've made the journey to the haunted DMV and chosen, pragmatically, to consolidate your power in your existing shrunken village. Your family's farming more land than ever, and young William is working for you at an exorbitant sixpence a day. Your barn is full. You have cash buried beneath the floorboards. You should feel secure, wealthy, a true success story of the post-plague world. And yet the anxiety remains, a low hum beneath the quiet of the fields. You quickly realise that wealth in the medieval world is not just about what you earn, but what you can buy. This is where the paradox of the post-plague economy hits you square in the face. The very scarcity of labour that made your back valuable also devastated the production of everything else, driving prices for goods and services to astonishing, prohibitive heights. You are living in a period of intense, rapid price inflation, particularly for manufactured goods and livestock. Think about the simple objects that make your life possible. You need a new ploughshare, the iron tip that cuts the earth. Before the plague, there were 3 smiths in the next town, all competing for your business. Now, there is one elderly smith, and his apprentice, his son, and his supplier of raw iron are all dead. He is the last link in a fractured supply chain. You trudge to his forge, the silver weight of 6 shillings heavy in your purse. You watch him laboriously heat the iron. You ask for a price. "That'll be 4 shillings, farmer," he says without looking up, his voice raspy from the smoke. You gasp. Before the plague, a ploughshare cost perhaps 1 shilling, maybe 1 shilling and 6pence at most. 4 shillings! That's highway robbery, you exclaim. The smith finally stops hammering and fixes you with a weary gaze. Is it now? I have to walk 3 days to the nearest mine just to buy iron, because the local carters are dead or won't travel for less than a full day's wage. My bellows maker is dead. My son, who worked the hammer, is dead. I am one man doing the work of 4. You can pay my price, or you can watch your expensive new crop rot. This is the cold, hard logic of the price-wage spiral. Your wage as a farmer, the price of labour, has gone up drastically, allowing you to pay the smith. But the smith's costs, his own labour, the cost of raw materials, have gone up even more, and he has 0 competition. The plague didn't just cause a labour shortage, it caused a capital production crisis. The mainstream historical fact here is the significant disparity between agricultural prices and industrial artisan prices in the decades following the Black Death. While the price of grain, your product, initially fell in many areas due to the huge loss of mouths to feed, the prices of skilled services, masonry, carpentry, smithing, milling and fine fabrics, skyrocketed and stayed high for a generation. Your new wealth is constantly under assault by the cost of living. This has serious consequences for your farm investment. You need new oxen to work your expanded fields. You have cash, so you go to the cattle market. The man selling the pair of sturdy beasts demands an amount that makes your jaw ache. Why so high? Because the stockmen who raised them, the drovers who moved them, and the vets who cared for them are all fewer in number. Furthermore, any surviving neighbour who also expanded their holdings is competing with you, driving the price of livestock, a vital piece of farm capital, through the roof. The quirkier tidbit of this era is the sudden importance of second-hand tools and clothes. Because new production was so expensive and slow, people became scavengers in a world of abundance. You might pay a small fortune for Thomas Cooper's old rusty but repairable scythe that you borrowed earlier, formerly purchasing it from the nervous steward for a low recorded price, more creative accounting. Old farm implements, once left to rust, were now lovingly restored. The trade in used goods, the inherited detritus of the dead, became a significant part of the local economy, as it represented a massive discount on the prohibitive cost of new, artisan-made items. You realise that to stay ahead, you can't just rely on growing more. You must become more self-sufficient. Your wife, for instance, starts spinning and weaving more aggressively, producing not just enough cloth for your family, but a surplus that can be traded or sold. This is a return to a more household-based economy for many basic needs, bypassing the outrageously priced artisans. This tension between income and expenditure leads to an interesting scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the post-plague inflation was a result of purely demographic changes, fewer producers, or if it was fundamentally driven by a temporary increase in the per capita wealth of the survivors, leading to a demand shock that the shattered production network simply could not meet. For you, it feels like both. You have more money than your father ever dreamed of, but there's simply nowhere to spend it efficiently, creating a bizarre financial bottleneck. You're forced to become a very shrewd strategic spender. You will spend 4 shillings on the ploughshare because you must, as it is an investment in capital that will yield a massive return. But you will postpone buying that beautiful new wool tunic you wanted, because the tailor is demanding twice the pre-plague price. This calculated restraint is how you protect your capital. The most important decision you make is to hoard silver and gold. With prices for goods being so volatile and labour wages so high, cash is a powerful tool. It gives you the flexibility to buy when prices momentarily drop, or to attract labour immediately when a competitor cannot. You are, in a very small way, becoming a medieval capitalist, using accumulated wealth strategically, rather than living hand to mouth. The practical impact of this high price of scarcity forces your hand on a major project: home improvement. You know the high price of a new home is a terrible investment, but the need for a better, more secure dwelling is paramount. You're tired of your drafty, smoke-filled hovel with its dirt floor and single room. You have wealth now, and the ultimate symbol of a secure, rising family is a strong, permanent home. You've delayed the fine clothes, but you cannot delay the foundational security. You decide to hire a travelling mason and a carpenter, paying their exorbitant rates but demanding quality and permanence. You are investing your hard-won capital into fixed assets, a solid, defensible, and comfortable home that will secure your family's status for generations. The cost is astronomical, but the enduring benefit is even greater. This transition, from a temporary wood and wattle dwelling to a sturdy stone and timber house, is the next visible step in your family's remarkable ascent. It's the material evidence that the age of the serf is ending, and the age of the yeoman is beginning, even if you have to pay the smith 4 shillings for a tiny piece of iron to prove it. You've navigated the volatile post-plague market, successfully bringing in an expanded harvest despite the high cost of labour. You have surplus grain and a stash of silver, but your success is currently housed in a crumbling prehistoric structure that your grandfather would barely have recognised as an upgrade from a cave. Your current dwelling is a single, smoky room with walls of wattle and daub, a roof of rotting thatch, and a damp earth floor. Before the plague, this was simply the norm. Poverty was structural, and a better house was an unattainable fantasy. Now it is an unacceptable risk to your family and a poor reflection of your rising yeoman status. The high prices for artisan skills, the scarcity paradox we just discussed, means building is expensive, but you view it not as a frivolous expense, but as a crucial long-term investment. You are determined to spend your capital on a house that will last for generations, a house that physically manifests the freedom you've won. The mainstream historical fact here is the significant shift in peasant housing quality immediately following the Black Death. The increased per capita wealth and the acute shortage of labour led to a widespread rebuilding movement. Peasants moved away from flimsy, temporary structures toward more substantial, durable homes built with stone foundations, sturdy timber framing, and sometimes even roof tiles instead of cheap thatch. This is known as the Great Rebuilding, and while it primarily took off later, the seeds were sown right now in your ambition. Your plan is ambitious. You're not just patching the old hovel, you're tearing it down and building a 2-bay cruck-framed house. You've paid a travelling master carpenter, a man named Elias, who demanded a king's ransom but promised quality, to source and prepare the massive curved timbers that will form the structural arches or crux of your new home. Elias insists on building on a proper stone plinth to keep the timber framing out of the damp ground, extending the life of the structure by decades. This simple act of building on a stone base is a radical step toward permanence. This construction project immediately highlights the shift in your social standing. Before, building a house was a communal affair, neighbours helping neighbours, overseen by the Lord's bailiff. Now you are hiring labour. You pay Elias and his 3 assistants, plus a couple of local unskilled labourers, including young William, your high-wage field hand, to work on the construction during the off-season. You're managing a construction site, paying wages, sourcing materials and directing a crew. You're acting as a small-scale contractor and patron. Inside, the changes are even more revolutionary. Your old house had a single open hearth in the centre. filling the entire room with acrid smoke that stung your eyes and coated everything in soot. The smoke was intended to escape through a hole in the roof, but mostly it just lingered, giving you that authentic, gritty medieval feel and destroying your lungs. Your new house will have a proper chimney and fireplace built into a stone wall. This seemingly minor architectural addition is the quirky tidbit of this section, but it is actually life-changing. A chimney is a massive status symbol because it requires a skilled mason and substantial stone, both of which are ruinously expensive, but it separates the smoke from your living space. This single change allows for a second floor, a small dedicated sleeping loft or chamber, because the upper space is no longer a smoke-filled hazard. You, the former serf, will now sleep on a separate level from your animals and your cooking area. This creates an unprecedented level of privacy and comfort, a clear physical separation between your family's public and private life. You also invest in fenestration, windows. Not large, expensive glass windows, of course, but proper framed openings with wooden shutters and possibly even panels of translucent horn or waxed linen to let in light while keeping out the worst of the weather. No more relying on a perpetually open doorway for light. This transformation of the interior, from a dark, smoky, single-room communal space to a multi-level, relatively bright and clean home with dedicated functions, is the clearest physical indicator of your ascent. You even install a wooden floor on the ground level covering the cold, damp earth. This investment is purely about hygiene and comfort. Imagine the sheer luxury of sweeping dirt out of your house, rather than sweeping dirt on dirt. The physical comfort alone speaks to the increased value you place on your family's well-being, an unheard-of concept for peasants a generation prior. The Baron, of course, notices the construction. His own manor house is falling into disrepair. He can't afford the masons you can. He may ride by, his face a mask of aristocratic disdain, trying to figure out how you, his tenant, can afford to build a sturdier house than his own tenants who are still alive. His resentment is palpable. He tries to remind you that the timber came from his forest, which it did, technically, under the old rules. You simply reply that you paid a high price for the wood from Elias, who purchased it from a broker in the next county, making the chain of title murky enough to prevent an immediate seizure. You are using the system's own newfound complexity against the simple authority of the Lord. This material improvement leads directly to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the post-plague rise in peasant material standards, the better housing, clothing and diet, was fundamentally driven by the increase in disposable income, the push of higher wages, or by the reduced psychological and spiritual oppression, which allowed survivors to feel worthy of investing in their own secular comfort, the pull of self-worth. For you, it is clearly both. You now have the money, but more importantly, you have the emotional security to believe that this investment won't be immediately stripped away by a capricious lord. The completion of the house is a moment of profound triumph. The day you sit by the new fireplace, watching the smoke draw neatly up the chimney instead of swirling in your face, is the day you know you have truly won the first great battle against the consequences of the plague. You have turned the terror of death into the tangible reality of a better life. The house is a symbol of your family's newfound permanence and status, but a new house requires sustenance, and the food you eat, like the house you live in, is about to undergo a remarkable revolutionary change. No longer will you live on a thin gruel of the cheapest barley and peas. Your rising status demands, and your expanded finances can afford, a diet that reflects your economic ascent, a diet rich in protein and quality grain. You've finished the hard-won construction of your new house. Stone plinth, chimney, and even that blissful upstairs sleeping chamber. The smell of fresh-cut timber and newly laid plaster fills the air, a scent that speaks of permanence and prosperity. You have secured your land and your shelter. Now you turn your attention to the most immediate, pleasurable indicator of your changed status: what you eat. Before the plague, your diet was a relentless, monotonous grind designed for subsistence. It was built on the cheapest, coarsest grains, barley, oats, maybe a few pulses like peas and beans, made into a thick, watery porridge or a heavy, dark bread. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for the great feast days of the church calendar, or maybe a tiny shared portion of scraggly bacon. The Lord's table was piled high with roasted swans and venison. Your table was a study in nutritional minimalism. The mainstream historical fact here is the dramatic and sustained improvement in the diet of the surviving peasantry in the post-plague era. Simply put, there were far fewer people and just as many acres of farmland, which meant the land could be managed better, allowing for shifts in production. The pressure to grow the maximum amount of low-quality grain to feed a burgeoning population was suddenly relieved. This relief translated directly to your plate. Your first great dietary shift is the move from low-quality grains to wheat. Wheat requires better soil and more careful milling, and it was once a grain reserved mostly for the Lord's table, or for use as cash crop for market. Now you're eating manchet, high-quality white bread, on a regular basis. The simple sensory pleasure of biting into a slice of soft white yeasted bread, a texture previously unimaginable, is a daily testament to your new wealth. But the most significant change is the rise of protein. With fewer people to eat them, livestock numbers were initially quite high. While the price of buying new oxen for capital investment was astronomical, remember section 6, the price of eating some of your own stock or poaching a few extra rabbits is a different calculus. Moreover, the lords struggling to manage their estates often loosened their iron grip on the vast common lands and forests where game, pigs and cattle grazed. You and your family are now eating meat, cheese and eggs with a regularity that would have scandalised your ancestors. You have roast chicken, a luxury that was once unthinkable, stews thick with beef or mutton, and plenty of butter and rich cheese from your growing private herd. This protein-rich diet immediately changes your family's physical health. Your children are taller, stronger, and less prone to the wasting diseases that plagued the pre-plague generation. This leads us to a fascinating quirky tidbit. The post-plague period saw an incredible boom in the popularity of ale. Before, ale was thin, watery, and often made from barley or oats. Now, with better grain available, you are drinking strong, thick, nutritious good ale, brewed from higher quality malted barley. Your family isn't just drinking it for pleasure. It is a major source of calories and essential nutrients, and because the water supply was often contaminated, drinking brewed ale was simply safer. Your wife starts brewing a slightly stronger, higher quality batch, not just for the family but for sale to the few remaining neighbours, a small, profitable side hustle that capitalises on your access to quality grain. The act of sharing a generous tankard of your own good ale with William, your well-paid labourer, is a powerful ritual of your new status, showing you are a patron, not a master. Your increased diet necessitates better tableware. You might at last acquire some simple, sturdy pottery bowls and plates to replace the rough, scooped-out wooden trenchers, or worse, eating straight from the communal pot. The very act of having an individual eating vessel, perhaps even a simple metal spoon instead of using a piece of bread, marks another small step away from primitive communal living towards an individualized, more dignified existence. This material and culinary ascent does not, however, go unnoticed by the ruling class. The sight of a peasant growing robust on a diet fit for a minor lord is an affront to the natural order. How dare you, the mud-stained worker, be as well-fed as the gentry? Their resentment is not just social, it is theological. They believed their superior diet was God's reward for their superior position. Your improved health threatens their entire ideology. This whole discussion brings up a significant open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the improvement in peasant diet was the primary cause of the increased life expectancy and physical stature observed in the post-plague generations, or if the lower population density, which reduced the spread of endemic disease and allowed for better hygiene, was the more decisive factor. For you, it feels like the food. You can feel the new strength in your back, the solidness in your limbs. The constant hunger that defined your youth is gone, replaced by a satisfying fullness that fuels your long days of work. Your diet is now a form of quiet political resistance. Every mouthful of mutton, every slice of white bread, is a celebration of your economic victory over the remnants of feudalism. You have the cash to hire labour, the land to grow quality crops, and the freedom to consume the best of your own produce. You realise that this increased wealth and leisure is enabling you to consider things that were once irrelevant to survival. Things like fashion and social standing. You're strong, well-fed, and you live in a decent house. The next logical step is to address your appearance. Why should your clothes be any worse than your diet? The move toward better clothing is an outward signal to the world that you're no longer a serf. A signal the aristocracy will try desperately to silence with laws designed to keep you literally in your place. The taste of your good strong ale is still on your tongue, but you're already thinking about the colour of your new tunic. You've secured the land, built a comfortable home with its precious chimney, and your family is finally eating white bread and mutton, the diet of gentry. Your physical transformation is complete. You are stronger, healthier, and perhaps taller than your ancestors. The last, most visible piece of the puzzle is appearance. Why should a family with such wealth and security still wear the drab, rough, undyed wool that marks you as a peasant? Before the plague, class distinction was not subtle, it was mandatory. The quality of your clothing was an instant non-negotiable marker of your social position. Peasants wore simple, often grey or brown homespun wool, undyed or dyed cheaply with local, muted plant matter like madder or woad, resulting in dull greens or blues. Silk, fine linen, furs, and especially bright expensive dyes like scarlet, cochineal red, were reserved for the nobility. This was the visual shorthand of feudal power. Now, with your high wages and accumulated silver, you want a new coat. You visit the town market and ignore the rough, cheap bolts of cloth. You look at the deep, vibrant colours, the intense reds, the sharp yellows, and the luxurious imported fabrics. You can finally afford them. The mainstream historical fact here is that the newfound wealth of the surviving peasantry and urban labourers led to an unprecedented democratisation of fashion. Peasants started buying and wearing clothes that were richer in colour, higher in quality, and often more fashionable than their immediate social betters, the minor gentry. This blurring of visual boundaries was deeply unsettling to the ruling class. They saw it as an existential threat. If they couldn't tell a peasant from a noble merely by looking at them, the entire social hierarchy might collapse. So, in a desperate, panicked attempt to police your personal wardrobe, the authorities enacted sumptuary laws. This is your next political battle, fought not with pitchforks, but with thread and needle. These laws, passed in various forms across Europe, were designed explicitly to preserve social status through dress codes. They dictated, often with ridiculous specificity, who could wear what based purely on their income, land value, or status. You hear the official proclamation of the latest sumptuary law read in the market square. It decrees that men of your rank, those who own land valued under a certain amount or whose annual income is below a threshold, are forbidden from wearing cloth of gold or silver or embroidered silk. Fair enough, you weren't planning on that. Any cloth that costs more than a specific amount per yard, any colours dyed with expensive imported dyes, such as true scarlet, cochineal, or fine Tyrian purple, which, to be honest, was almost impossible to get anyway. Certain types of fur, like ermine or sable. The absurdity of the law is its lack of practical enforcement. How is the local constable, who is also farming his own expanded strips, and wearing a surprisingly vibrant blue tunic himself, supposed to accurately assess the cost per yard of the cloth you're wearing? You decide to purchase a coat made of good, solid wool, but dyed a rich, deep bottle green. The dye is expensive, but not technically forbidden by the letter of the law, which targets the more famous reds and purples. You also have your wife line it with a decent but affordable sheepskin fur, a practical item that looks suspiciously like a status symbol. The feeling of wearing this new coat is transformative. It's warm, it hangs well, and the colour is striking. When you walk through the village, you look less like a beast of burden and more like a prosperous yeoman, a man of substance and property. This quiet revolution in clothing is the quirkier tidbit of the section. The aristocracy passed laws to stop the visual blurring of lines, but the peasantry responded not by openly defying the law with silk, but by mastering the quality of legally permissible fabrics. Your new green coat is simply better made, better tailored, and cleaner than the Baron Steward's old threadbare doublet. You're using superior capital to demonstrate superior taste, creating a subtle defiance that the law cannot touch. The psychological impact of seeing a common labourer wearing such finery should not be understated. To the lords, it was a visible sign of social disorder, a world turned upside down. They believed that if people dressed above their station, they would naturally begin to act above their station, demanding political rights to match their economic power. And they weren't entirely wrong. This struggle over fashion and status highlights an important open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws were primarily intended to maintain class distinctions and visual hierarchy, or if they were an economic tool designed to curb the sudden, massive consumption of imported luxury goods and prevent the rapid depletion of the kingdom's silver reserves. For you, it feels purely political. They don't care about the silver, they care about their right to look down on you. One day, you see the effect of this sartorial defiance firsthand. Young William, your high-wage hand, shows up for work wearing a pair of brightly dyed hosen stockings in a vibrant red. The colour is bold, almost scandalous. The nervous bailiff, Giles, remember him, tries to enforce the law, pointing to the hosen and stammering about the statute. William simply shrugs. They were a gift, Giles, he says, a smirk playing on his lips. And they're made of wool, not silk. The colour is common madder, not cochineal. They're just good honest woolhosen, but they've been darned nicely. The argument dissolves because the law is vague and the enforcer is weak. The lords want the simple power of recognition, but you, the survivors, have introduced the complex power of choice and nuance. Your investment in your wardrobe, like your investment in your house, is part of a larger strategy, securing your family's place in the new social order. You're consciously transitioning your family's identity from villains, unfree peasants, to yeomen, prosperous independent farmers. The clothes are the outward uniform of this new class, but the final, most enduring freedom you crave isn't about clothes or food, it's about the legal structure that binds you to the land. The old system, the core of feudalism, relies on your obligation to work the lord's fields. The next step in your revolution is eliminating that obligation entirely, replacing forced labour with the clean, straightforward transaction of cash rent. This is the final break from the life of your ancestors. You stand tall in your sturdy new house and your fine green coat. Your belly is full of beef and wheat bread. You have established yourself as a man of substance, but one final archaic chain still binds you to the old system, the labour service, or corvée. The lord of the manor, Baron Reginald, still holds the theoretical right to demand that you spend a specific number of days each year working on his domain, his private land, often during the crucial harvest or planting seasons when you need to be on your own expanded fields. This is the ultimate confrontation between the old feudal order and the new market-driven reality. Before the plague, the lord demanded your labour because it was free, reliable and compulsory, and he had no incentive to do otherwise. Now your labour is the most valuable commodity in the realm, and forcing you to work for him, essentially for free, is an unbearable drag on your own productive capacity. The mainstream historical fact here is the widespread and pragmatic commutation of labour services into fixed cash rents in the decades following the Black Death. This process of commutation, the conversion of feudal obligations from labour to cash, was the definitive stroke that dismantled the medieval serfdom system and created a class of genuinely free tenants. The Baron, or more likely his terrified, financially stressed steward, approaches you not with a whip and threats, but with a ledger and a desperate calculation. His calculation is simple. He needs hands on his domain to grow his own crop, but he cannot pay the high market wages, like the sixpence you pay William. Furthermore, if he demands your traditional service, you will perform it slowly, begrudgingly, and poorly, the classic peasant resistance known as bad work. He realises he's losing money two ways. He can't hire enough paid labour, and the forced labour he gets is useless. So, the negotiation begins. The steward proposes converting your 2 days of weekly corvée into a fixed annual rent. We shall henceforth require you to pay 10 shillings per year instead of your customary service, the steward suggests, adjusting his collar nervously. You, having already established your worth, smile faintly and shake your head. 10 shillings? Sir, my 2 days of work for just one harvest week are worth 6 shillings alone at the market rate. To expect me to pay 10 shillings to buy back my own time for an entire year is simply exorbitant. I will pay 5 shillings for the year, and I will perform no service. This audacity is the key. Before you accepted his terms, now you dictate yours. He might protest, but he is in a terrible bind. If he refuses, you might move to the empty manor down the road, the one we talked about visiting, where a desperate lord will grant you the copyhold you desire for a nominal rent. The Baron is now competing for your loyalty and your rent. Eventually, through haggling that lasts for weeks, you settle on 6 shillings. This new arrangement is formalised in your copyhold agreement, making you a rent-paying tenant rather than a service-rendering serf. The significance of this transition cannot be overstated. By converting your labour obligation to a fixed cash rent, you have gained control of your own time. You can dedicate 100% of your labour to your own, now expanded fields maximising your personal profit. Turn the rent into a fixed, declining cost. The 6 shillings is fixed for the foreseeable future. With the post-plague inflation, remember the price of that ploughshare, the real value of that 6 shillings slowly declines over time. The Lord's income is shrinking while your income is rising. This is the financial engine of your family's eventual prosperity. Achieved personal freedom. The essence of a serf was being tied to the land and obligated to service. You're now merely a leaseholder, an independent farmer whose only obligation is a predictable, manageable, and gradually less onerous cash payment. This move from labour to cash payments is the quirkier tidbit of this section. The Lords thought they were simply getting a stable cash income instead of unreliable labour. What they actually did was shift the risk of production entirely onto the tenant. Before, if the harvest was bad, the Lord's domain suffered directly. Now, if the harvest is bad, you still owe the fixed 6 shillings. If the harvest is good, however, you keep 100% of the surplus profit, minus that fixed rent. You are now an entrepreneur who has purchased the freedom to profit enormously. This fundamental restructuring highlights a key open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the transition to cash rents was a voluntary, strategic move by lords seeking to simplify estate management, or a forced concession driven by the irresistible economic leverage of the peasantry and the complete failure of the old coercive methods. For you, it feels like a forced concession. The baron was backed into a corner by the simple arithmetic of too few people and too much land. The concept of copyhold, the secure, heritable tenure you now possess, is the legal anchor of your new status. You hold a copy of the manorial roll entry that grants you the land, usually for the payment of an annual rent and a small fine, heriot, upon the death of the main tenant. This document, which you guard more fiercely than your silver, secures your family's generational link to the land. You are no longer tenants at will. You are now the stable, foundational middle class of the English countryside. You now spend your days not thinking about the Lord's fields, but about the future of your own family's wealth. Your children, growing up in a house with a chimney and on a diet of white bread, are already fundamentally different from you. They are not defined by servitude. They are defined by opportunity. This leads to the next crucial decision you must face. What will you do with this freedom and this wealth? You've invested in land, shelter, and food, but the most powerful investment you can make is in the education of your children. Giving them knowledge means giving them access to trades, to the church, to the law, to an entirely different world that lies outside the boundaries of the farm. Your fight for economic freedom is won. Now, the fight for social mobility begins. You've secured your family's economic future. The land is theirs, the house is sound, and the debt of labour service has been commuted into a fixed, manageable cash rent. You are no longer a serf, you are a wealthy yeoman. But wealth is fragile, tied to the soil and the fickle weather. You realise that to truly secure your family's future across generations, you must invest in something intangible, but infinitely valuable: knowledge. Your own life was dictated by the cycle of the seasons and the demands of the Lord. Your education consisted of how to plough a straight furrow, mend a fence, and perhaps recite the Lord's Prayer by rote. Your children, however, live in a world of accelerating change, a world where the ability to read a ledger or write a contract is fast becoming as valuable as a strong back. The mainstream historical fact here is the significant increase in literacy rates and the expansion of educational opportunities for the lower and middle classes in the century following the Black Death. The mass mortality created a huge number of vacancies in the church, in government administration, and in the growing urban merchant guilds. These jobs required basic literacy and numeracy, and for the first time, these positions were opening up to the sons of prosperous peasants like you. The old rule, that only the nobility or the urban patriciate needed education, was shattered by the urgent need for competent clerks and administrators. You decide that your eldest son, Thomas, named in memory of your neighbour perhaps, will learn to read and write. Since there is no formal village school, you must be creative. You might approach the local parish priest who survived the plague and is now better paid than ever, asking him to teach Thomas the rudiments of Latin and the vernacular English. The priest, eager for the extra income and perhaps motivated by a new post-plague zeal to serve his now smaller flock, agrees for a hefty fee, paid of course in silver from your buried stash. Thomas starts his lessons. He learns to trace the letters on a wax tablet or cheap parchment. He learns the Paternoster and the Credo, but more importantly, he learns basic arithmetic, how to add up the bushels of grain, calculate wages, and verify the changing weight of coinage. This is not a religious education. It is a practical commercial education. You want him to be able to read your copyhold and understand the intricacies of the manorial court records, ensuring that Baron Reginald or his future successors can never again trick your family with convoluted legal language. The sheer difficulty of obtaining educational material is a quirkier tidbit of this era. Books were still incredibly expensive, and paper was still rare. Thomas's primer might be nothing more than a few sheets of scraped vellum bound with string, containing the alphabet and a few religious phrases. To practice, he might use a board covered in sand, tracing letters with his finger. Yet, this meagre access to the tools of learning is enough to unlock a new future. Imagine the dinner table conversation. You talk about the harvest, the price of wool, and the repair of a fence. Thomas talks about the letters he learned, the numbers he calculated, and the strange formal language of the documents the priest showed him. He's bridging two worlds, the physical world of the farm and the abstract world of finance and law. Your daughter, if you have one, also benefits from this focus on education. While formal schooling is less common for girls, your wife, who may have already been proficient in household account keeping, teaches her to manage the new, complex household budget. She learns to read basic trade receipts, calculate the cost of yarn, and manage the profits from your wife's ale brewing enterprise. Remember that little side hustle? This training is vital, as women often ran the farm finances while men were in the fields or travelling to market. This investment opens two powerful doors for Thomas. The church. With so many priests and monks dead, the church is desperately seeking new, educated recruits. Thomas could enter a minor order, securing a stable, respectable, and powerful position outside the farming life. The guild's town administration. If he is educated, he's a prime candidate to become an apprentice in a prosperous urban guild, something we'll discuss later. Or, more immediately, a clerk in a town's municipal office or for a wealthy merchant. He moves from being a producer of food to being a manager of commerce. This transition from physical labour to intellectual labour is a profound shift in social mobility. Your family is planting the seed not just for more wealth, but for higher status. You will still be a farmer, but your son could be a parish clerk, a lawyer's assistant, or a prosperous merchant's factor. This development leads to an important open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the increased access to education for the common people was primarily a result of the church's attempt to replenish its ranks and uphold piety after the plague, or if it was driven by the secular mercantile demand for competent clerks and the simple ability of yeomen to afford the fees. For you, the father paying the fee, it feels entirely commercial. You're buying your son a career that doesn't rely on the whims of a lord or the vagaries of the weather. The irony is rich. The very lord you fought to escape still relies on records, contracts, and administration. By educating your son, you are giving him the tools to understand and exploit the complexities of the system that once oppressed you. You are giving him the power of the written word. With your son's path secured, your attention is now drawn to the final, great temptation of the post-plague world, the town. The manor is still too slow, too bound by tradition. The true nexus of the new, rapid, cash-based economy is the urban centre, where specialised skills and mercantile profit are exploding. The city offers the ultimate escape from the soil, a place where money is made not by growing things but by selling things, and this magnet-like pull is starting to feel irresistible. You've secured your family's future on the land, successfully converting your servitude into a prosperous tenancy. Your son Thomas is learning his letters, preparing for a life beyond the plough. But the farm, even the newly expanded and profitable farm, feels slow. It is bound by the rhythm of the seasons, and your wealth is locked up in the slow growth of crops and livestock. The true dynamism of the post-plague world, the rapid cash-based wealth creation, is happening somewhere else, the town. The magnet-like pull of the nearly empty urban centres is immense. Before the plague, medieval towns and cities were overcrowded, filthy and miserable places, but they offered economic specialisation and freedom unmatched in the countryside. The Black Death hit these dense populations hardest. cities often lost half, sometimes two-thirds, of their inhabitants. The death toll was catastrophic, but for you, the survivor in the countryside, the news of the empty houses and the desperate need for skilled labour is the sound of pure, unadulterated opportunity. The mainstream historical fact here is the significant migration of rural survivors into urban areas immediately following the plague. This movement was driven by the immense economic opportunities presented by the urban vacuum. The death of so many craftsmen, merchants, and administrators meant that competition for starting a new business, joining a guild, or becoming a municipal official was dramatically reduced. The barrier to entry to urban wealth plummeted. You decide to make a journey to the nearest major town, perhaps 20 miles away, a journey you would have rarely undertaken before, but now feel compelled to make. As you ride, you see the remnants of the disaster everywhere: derelict workshops, abandoned houses, and wide, strange streets where before the plague crowds made passage a slow ordeal. The town's economy is running on a skeleton crew. Think about the trades that matter in a town. The baker, the candle maker, the tanner, the weaver, and the butcher. The man who made your costly ploughshare, remember him from Section 6, likely survived, but his competitors didn't. This massive reduction in competition means that surviving urban artisans can charge monopoly prices for their goods and services. The profitability of urban crafts is soaring. Your thought process shifts from a farmer's mindset, how much grain can I grow, to an entrepreneur's mindset, what service can I offer that nobody else is offering? You're a skilled farmer, yes, but your greatest skill might be your management and your capital, the silver you've saved. You realise the town offers the ultimate escape from the remnants of the manorial system. Town air, as the saying went, makes a man free. If you could establish residence in a chartered town for a year and a day, you could usually claim freedom from any feudal obligations you might still hold. While your copyhold already bought you economic freedom, the town offered legal and personal freedom, the final definitive break from Baron Reginald's lingering influence. The town is a place of guilds, which act as both protectors and gatekeepers of the urban economy. The craft guilds, like the Weavers' Guild or the Goldsmiths, controlled training, quality and pricing. Before the plague, gaining entry was a multi-year, expensive and near impossible task for a peasant's son. Now, however, the guilds are desperate to replenish their ranks to maintain production and their political power. This means they are more willing to take on apprentices from the countryside, often waiving the onerous entrance fees. This opening of the guilds is the quirkier tidbit of this section. The rules of apprenticeship, which often required years of service and sometimes a large payment, were suddenly relaxed or circumvented. A skilled, surviving craftsman might rush through the training of a new apprentice just to keep his shop running. Your educated son, Thomas, who can read and count, would be a prime candidate for a merchant's or a clerk's guild, trades that offered even higher status than manual crafts. You walk through the main town street past the deserted stalls and talk to a surviving draper. He needs help managing his accounts, sourcing wool from the countryside and selling fine cloth. He offers Thomas an apprenticeship not just in trade but in literacy and numeracy, with the promise of a share of the profits after 3 years. The offer is extraordinary, a direct route for your son out of the paysan class and into the bourgeoisie. This desire to leave the land and move to the town creates a complex open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the post-plague urban growth was primarily due to the push factor, peasants leaving the countryside to escape manorial oppression and high rents, or the pull factor, the irresistible economic lure of high urban wages, cheaper land housing and social opportunity. For you, contemplating the offer from the draper, it feels like the pull is now dominant. You're not running from poverty, you're walking towards explosive opportunity. You have the choice, and you choose the place where money flows faster. The decision you face is strategic. Do you keep Thomas on the farm, maximising the efficiency of your expanded land and ensuring your family stays whole? Or do you send him to town, sacrificing his labour, but securing a multi-generational legacy in a trade that is immune to crop failure? You decide to take the risk. You are a portfolio farmer. You keep the profitable farm running, but you diversify your family's assets by placing Thomas in the urban cash-based economy. You pay the draper a small fee, a formality now, not a barrier, and Thomas leaves the familiar fields for the exciting, if slightly intimidating, life of the town. This decision marks the fundamental break with the traditional peasant life. Your family is now split between two distinct economies, the rural agrarian economy, you, and the urban mercantile economy, Thomas. The farm provides security and capital, the town provides social ascent and liquid wealth. But this newfound independence and wealth, both rural and urban, is under constant threat from the old powers. The high wages, the fine clothes, the cash transactions, and the legal freedom you enjoy are all deeply resented. The ruling class, realising the statute of labour has failed to control wages, will soon resort to a simpler, more direct method of stealing back your wealth: taxation. The smouldering resentment among the elite and the new, radical confidence among the commoners is about to collide in a spectacular, violent national event. You are about to trade your quiet, individual struggle for a loud, collective one. You've established your economic empire, profitable farm, fine new house, and your son, Thomas, safely apprenticed in the booming urban economy. You're a successful yeoman, a man of substance, no longer a serf, but the ruling class, the gentry, the lords, and the king's government are watching your ascent with barely concealed fury. They see your high wages, your fine clothes, remember the deep green coat, and your children's education, and they perceive it as an existential injustice. They tried to stop the clock with the statute of labourers, and they failed. Now they try a simpler, more direct method to claw back your wealth and curb your insolence: taxation. The mainstream historical fact here is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, or Wat Tyler's Rebellion, the largest and most famous popular uprising in medieval English history. The direct catalyst was the imposition of the deeply unfair and highly resented poll tax. This was not a tax on land or income, which you might have been able to pay. It was a flat-rate tax levied on every single person over the age of 15, regardless of their wealth or station. It was designed to pay for the expensive, ultimately disastrous wars with France, and it fell disproportionately on the common people, the very people who had just experienced a massive increase in per capita wealth and a corresponding boost in their own sense of self-worth. The poll tax was the final inflammatory insult. You, the prosperous farmer, paying 6 shillings a year in rent, were being asked to pay the same head tax as the poorest labourer, and often more than a minor knight whose wealth was tied up in non-liquid assets. It was an attempt by the king's government to say, "We see your new wealth, and we will take it, simply because we can." The attempt to enforce this tax was aggressive and insulting. Royal commissioners were sent out to root out those who claimed their families had shrunk. Evasion was rampant, with people claiming children were younger than they were, or that relatives had died. The heavy-handed methods of the collectors, often coupled with inappropriate behaviour towards the wives and daughters of commoners, sparked the first violent acts of resistance. You and your neighbours are gathered in the local alehouse, where your wife's strong ale is still selling briskly. The news spreads like wildfire. A village miles away resisted the tax collectors, and the fight turned bloody. The time for quiet individual resistance, the creative accounting and the subtle defiance, is over. You are forced into a decision: risk everything for collective freedom, or meekly pay the tax and surrender the principle of your hard-won independence. The energy is intoxicating. The local resistance quickly coalesces into a massive organised force. The men who stand with you are no longer just your neighbours. They are men from 20 surrounding villages, all united by this single burning grievance. You march to the nearest administrative centre, perhaps to confront the local tax commissioner or the hated Baron Reginald himself. This uprising is the quirkier tidbit of the section. One of the key rallying cries and demands of the rebels was not just the abolition of the poll tax, but the complete and permanent abolition of all serfdom and labour services. In a massive, coordinated statement, the rebels destroyed manorial court records, the very copyholds you fought so hard to obtain, but also the records that detailed the services you once owed. They aimed to wipe the slate clean, legally destroying the documentation of the old feudal order. The symbolic power of burning the court rolls, rendering the history of their subjugation to ashes, was profound. You join the march. You walk not as a lone farmer, but as a unit, armed with pitchforks, axes, and the righteous anger of a class that has suddenly discovered its own collective power. The exhilaration of this moment is immense. You are directly challenging the king's authority. You may even march toward London, joining the swelling main body of the revolt under leaders whose names, Wat Tyler and John Ball, become legendary overnight. The revolt's demands were radical for the era. An end to the poll tax, the abolition of serfdom, fixed rents at a manageable rate, usually 4 pence per acre, and an end to the privileges of the ruling class. John Ball, the famous radical priest, preached, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" A clear, powerful articulation of the belief in human equality that flowed from the post-plague social changes. This brief, violent event leads to a central open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the peasants' revolt was a fundamentally conservative reaction against attempts to reverse the gains made since the Black Death, the attempt to impose the poll tax and restrict wages, or if it was a radical, forward-looking movement driven by newly empowered peasants demanding a share of political power and a complete break with feudalism. For you, as you march, it feels like both. A fierce defence of the liberties already won, coupled with a bold demand for total, permanent legal freedom. The revolt is brutally suppressed. Wat Tyler is killed, and King Richard II, a young, terrified boy at the time, promises concessions only to immediately renege on them once the threat subsides. Hundreds of rebels are executed and order is violently restored. You, luckily, manage to slip away and return to your farm, humbled but alive. The revolt failed in its immediate goals, but it succeeded on a larger, subtle level. The aristocracy was profoundly shaken. They understood that the collective will of the peasantry was now a volatile force that could not be ignored. The attempt to restore the old feudal system through brute force or punitive taxation was simply too dangerous. After 1381, although the official legal structures of serfdom lingered for a while, the reality was that labour services were essentially dead. The lords increasingly relied on the easier, less confrontational system of fixed cash rents and hiring free, wage-earning labourers, the system you already forced Baron Reginald to adopt. You return home, pick up your hoe, and go back to farming your expanded land. But you are changed. You have seen the power of the collective, and you know that your prosperity is not just a personal achievement, it is a political statement. You are a survivor of the plague, a successful farmer, and now a political rebel. The church, which failed to prevent the plague and whose officials supported the oppressive taxes, is the next institution to face your sceptical, empowered gaze. You've survived the plague, profited from the economic chaos, built a solid life, and even survived the bloodied fields of the peasants' revolt. You're a man of new wealth and radicalised confidence. But the foundation of medieval life, the Catholic Church, is also deeply shaken. The plague, an event of biblical scale, forced a profound spiritual reckoning among the survivors. How could a loving, omnipotent God allow such a disaster? And why did the very institution built to interpret God's will fail so miserably to prevent it? The mainstream historical fact here is the crisis of confidence and loss of respect for the Church's clergy in the post-plague era. The priests, monks and friars who were supposed to intercede with God were just as likely to die as the common peasant. Worse, in many areas, priests fled their parishes, abandoning their flock during the height of the epidemic, only to return afterwards demanding their old tithes and fees. This created a profound sense of clerical corruption and hypocrisy among the survivors. You attend Mass in your parish church, one of the few places in the village that is still fully intact, a relic of the old world. You notice the new priest, Father William. He is young, inexperienced, and recently appointed to fill the huge vacuum left by the deaths of the previous 2 incumbents. He is barely educated. Remember, your own son is getting a better education than some of these new priests, and his sermons are often rote and uninspired. Yet, he lives in a better house than the one you just built, thanks to the income of the now consolidated parish benefices. Your relationship with the church becomes a complex mix of deep piety and cynical distrust. You are deeply pious because the fear of God is real. You saw his wrath in the bodies piled high in the common grave. You give generously to the church, more so than before, but you are demanding about where your money goes. You might donate money not to the general parish fund, which you suspect Father William is using to buy himself better wine, but specifically to the construction of a new side chapel, or the purchase of a stained glass window dedicated to St. Christopher, the patron saint of travellers. This form of giving is the quirkier tidbit of this era. It was known as ostentatious piety. You're essentially bypassing the corrupt human institution of the local church and creating your own, visible monument to your family's faith and conveniently your wealth. This act serves 2 purposes. It ensures the money is spent on a lasting memorial, securing prayers for your family's soul, and it publicly displays your success, further elevating your status in the community. You're using the church to buy your way closer to God, but also closer to the gentry. The church's sudden wealth, thanks to the consolidation of endowments, the gifts and lands left to deceased priests and monasteries, made it a target. Why should the surviving clergy be so rich, while so many honest, hard-working families struggled? Furthermore, the church supported the king's taxes and the feudal order. This conflict led to radical dissenting voices, like the followers of John Wycliffe, the Lollards, who preached that the Bible, not the corrupt church hierarchy, should be the ultimate religious authority. You may not join the Lollards, but their ideas certainly resonate in your cynical mind. You look at the empty fields outside the monastery walls. The local abbey, which lost half its monks, now finds itself with vast unworked tracts of land, the gifts of pious deceased lords. The abbot, instead of leasing it to you, a productive farmer, is forced to hire expensive wage labour. You realise the church is a massive, inefficient landowner, bound by archaic rules and incompetent administration. It is economically out of step with the new world. This crisis of faith and institution leads to a major open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the post-plague spiritual upheaval was the foundational precursor to the Protestant Reformation 2 centuries later, by weakening the moral authority of the papacy and fostering anti-clericalism, or if the religious dissent was a local, temporary reaction that had little long-term doctrinal impact. For you, it feels like the foundation is cracked. You respect God, but you trust Father William as far as you can throw him, and you're far more concerned with your ledger than his sermon. Your new wealth gives you another freedom, the freedom to pursue personal spiritual comfort. You might hire a travelling chantry priest to say special private masses for the souls of your deceased family members. This personal, individualised transaction of faith, paying a priest directly to serve your family's spiritual needs, bypasses the slow, impersonal machinery of the parish church. You're essentially using your capital to purchase spiritual assurance on your own terms. The ultimate joke is that the church, meant to be the immutable rock of medieval society, was transformed by the very event it failed to prevent. It became richer, less competent, and more widely resented, while you, the common layman, became richer, more educated, and spiritually more demanding. Your piety is still there, deep and real, but it is filtered through a thick layer of self-interest and a sharp understanding of financial transactions. The structure of your immediate family life is also undergoing a quiet, pragmatic revolution. The massive death toll has reshuffled the deck of available partners, inheritances, and economic strategies. The next logical step, therefore, is to consider how your new wealth and status are shaping the most fundamental unit of society, marriage and family planning. You've survived the spiritual reckoning, retaining your piety while shedding your reverence for the corrupt local clergy. Now you turn your gaze inward, towards the most intimate and strategic element of your new life, the family unit. The demographic upheaval caused by the Black Death didn't just empty fields, it profoundly reshaped the social and economic logic behind medieval marriage and family size. Before the plague, life was characterized by intense population pressure. Land was scarce, and large families were often seen as both a necessity, more hands for the farm, and a liability, more mouths to feed from a fixed plot. For a serf, marrying young and having many children often meant more poverty, as the land couldn't sustain them all, forcing younger children into landless labour. The mainstream historical fact here is the rise in the average age of marriage for both men and women across the surviving population, particularly in the most prosperous classes like yours. Where peasants might have married in their late teens or early 20s before 1347, the post-plague yeoman frequently waited until his mid to late 20s. This was a deliberate, pragmatic economic choice. Why the delay? Because of your newfound wealth and expanded land holdings, you're no longer trying to survive on a tiny strip, you're trying to consolidate and expand a substantial estate. Marrying later meant that when your children eventually inherited, they would be older, more mature and more capable of managing the complex larger farm and its accounts. Remember, your son Thomas is already receiving a commercial education. More importantly, it meant fewer children in the immediate generation, reducing the strain of having to divide your newly acquired prime land. You're determined to pass on a whole prosperous farm to your heir, not to break it into unviable fragments. This strategic family planning is a hallmark of the new yeoman class. They prioritise the quality and security of the inheritance over the sheer quantity of offspring. You look at your daughter, who is now well into her 20s. Before, she would have been married years ago. Now she's an indispensable part of your household, helping your wife manage the brewing profits, spinning high-quality yarn, and keeping the increasingly complex farm records. You hold on to her for two reasons. Her labour is valuable, remember the high cost of labour, and you are waiting for a superior marriage match. You're looking for a spouse for her who is either a successful, land-rich yeoman like yourself, or, even better, the educated son of a rising urban merchant, someone who can connect your rural capital to the town's lucrative trade networks. The marriage is not simply a romantic union, it is a business merger, and your high status allows you to negotiate for a better dowry or a better settlement for your daughter. The quirkier tidbit of this era is the sudden importance of remarriage. Because of the mass mortality, many young widows and widowers inherited valuable assets, land, houses, tools, and cash. They became highly desirable marriage partners. If you were a widower, you could quickly secure a new wife who brought property into the marriage, further consolidating your family's holdings. If you were a young man of good reputation, you might successfully court a widow who was older but significantly wealthier than any single young woman available. The economic calculus of marriage briefly superseded traditional age and romantic norms. This focus on strategic family size is reflected in the cultural norms as well. Historians still argue whether the demographic changes of the post-plague era led to widespread intentional birth control practices, such as coitus, interruptus, or increased periods of abstinence, or if the drop in fertility rates was purely a function of later marriage ages and biological factors. For you, the delay in marriage is an acknowledged fact of life, an intentional delay of childbearing designed to protect the integrity of your land. You are choosing security over immediate procreation. Your new life as a successful yeoman means your children now have high expectations. They expect a substantial inheritance, a well-built home, and a life free from servitude. This creates a new, quiet kind of pressure. You must manage your farm not just for annual survival, but for multi-generational stability. The days of endless back-breaking labour simply to feed the next generation are gone, replaced by the intellectual labour of strategic financial planning. This deliberate decision to consolidate wealth and power through controlled family size and strategic marriages is the final intimate sign of the end of the old feudal world. The logic of the feudal world demanded quantity of labour. The logic of the yeoman world demands quality of inheritance and strategic capital deployment. Now that your family structure is secure, your attention returns to the land itself, but with a new awareness of collective rights. Your success came, in part, from expanding onto common land. But you're not the only one doing this. And the issue of who controls the village's shared resources is about to become the next flashpoint of conflict. You're moving from the individual fight for tenure to the collective fight for common access. You've stabilised your family, planned your legacy, and cemented your status as a prosperous yeoman, an independent player in the new economy. Your success came from appropriating and consolidating abandoned strips of land. But the land is not just strips. It's also the common land, the shared meadows, pastures and woodlands that belonged in theory to the entire manorial community, and in practice were essential to the survival of the poorest villagers. Now, you and your neighbours, emboldened by your economic power, begin to assert new, collective rights over these commons, leading to the very first subtle conflicts that whisper the coming storm of enclosure. The mainstream historical fact here is that the sharp reduction in the population led to the conversion of large areas of arable, ploughed land back into pasture, because there simply weren't enough hands to work the fields efficiently, and the price of wool and meat remained high. This shift meant that the remaining villagers placed a much higher value on the common grazing land. You, for instance, own more cattle and sheep than your father ever could, and you rely on the common pasture for their sustenance. The conflict arises when the few surviving lords or their ambitious wealthy tenants, often merchants or wealthy farmers from outside the village, begin to see the common land not as a community resource but as a potential private profit centre. They start taking small, symbolic but crucial steps to claim or enclose parts of the common. They might run a hedge or a ditch across a piece of the moor, or they might unilaterally declare that the village's pigs can no longer root in a specific patch of woodland that technically belongs to the manor. You, the established yeoman farmer, find yourself in a strange dual role. On the one hand, you are the most powerful farmer in the village, and you benefit most from having your large herd graze on the common. You have a vested interest in keeping the common open and well managed. On the other hand, your success was built on enclosing your neighbour's arable strips. This time, however, the target is the common, a shared resource vital to everyone. When Baron Reginald's new steward, a sharp-eyed, legalistic man named Richard, attempts to fence off a crucial section of the common meadow, claiming it as the Lord's private domain, you take action. You don't just grumble, you organise. You gather the remaining villagers, including the few poor labourers who rely entirely on the common for their single cow or geese. You are fighting for the collective right of turbery, the right to cut turf or peat for fuel, and the right of common pasture. You lead a communal action that is a quiet, legal echo of the violent uprising of 1381. You don't burn the manor house. Instead, you and your neighbours perform a ceremony called levelling the ditches, or pulling down the hedges. Under the cover of darkness, you systematically pull up the steward's new fence posts and fill in his ditches, restoring the common boundary to its traditional limits. When confronted by the steward, you argue not based on revolutionary sentiment, but on customary law, asserting that the hedge is a breach of the ancient unwritten rights of the manor's tenants. The quirkier tidbit here is how this customary law was preserved and articulated. Since the original manorial records detailing the full common rights might have been destroyed in the revolt, or lost in the plague, the villagers had to rely on the collective, often oral, memory of the oldest survivors. The oldest living man in the village suddenly became a legal expert, recalling exactly where the boundaries traditionally lay, how many animals each household was historically allowed to graze, the right of stint, and when the lord was allowed to take timber. This reliance on oral tradition became the main defence against the lord's written, but often fabricated, claims. You are protecting the common not out of pure altruism, but out of strategic necessity. You need the common for your own prosperity, and uniting with the remaining villagers strengthens your hand against the Lord. You are fighting against the privatisation of resources that threatens your own access. This struggle over common rights introduces a complex open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the post-plague assertion of common rights by the yeomanry was a true reflection of communal agrarian ideals, or if it was a self-interested strategy by the wealthiest peasants to maintain cheap, easily accessible grazing for their own expanded herds, sometimes at the expense of the genuinely poor. For you, as you level the hedge, the motivation is a practical blend. You're protecting your sheep, but you're also using the power of the community to fight a wealthy, oppressive land claim, and you need those poor villagers to stand with you. The fight is often settled in the manorial court, where the collective testimony of the surviving tenants, armed with their oral history, often manages to sway the nervous steward. The Lord's attempts at enclosure are typically premature at this stage. He doesn't have the legal or political muscle to overcome a unified village. You win the skirmish, and the common meadow remains open, a victory for the preservation of custom and community. This local battle over the common land is crucial. It teaches you that even with all your personal wealth and freedom, the defence of your economic position sometimes requires collective organisation and a strict adherence to the law, or at least the interpretation of the law that favours your class. Having secured your rural base and protected your collective rights, your mind returns to the town. Your son, Thomas, is thriving in his urban apprenticeship. He is learning about specialisation, trade, and the immense power of the guilds. You know that the ultimate institutionalised form of economic power lies not in the field, but in the walled city. The next step in securing your family's status is understanding and navigating the complexities of the urban guild system, the new aristocratic order of the commercial world. You've won the battles in the field, securing your copyhold, protecting the commons, and successfully challenging the Lord's authority. Your son, Thomas, is now a few years into his apprenticeship in the town, and the reports coming back are excellent. He is thriving in a world of cash, contracts, and commercial law, a world utterly removed from the soil that grounded your own life. You realise that the urban guild system is the new aristocracy, a formidable new social and economic ladder that your family must climb. The guilds are the institutionalised form of the urban opportunity created by the plague. Before the Black Death, the guilds were restrictive, highly exclusive, and often hereditary, making it virtually impossible for a peasant's son to gain entry. The mass death, however, shattered this structure. creating an urgent existential need for new members to maintain the craft's production and the guild's political power. The mainstream historical fact here is that the guilds were forced to relax their restrictive membership requirements and shorten apprenticeship terms to fill the vacancies. This created an unprecedented opportunity for rural migrants with capital and ability like your son Thomas to enter trades that were previously closed off. The guilds of the post-plague era were a primary vehicle for rapid upward social mobility. Thomas is apprenticed to a draper, a member of the powerful Mercer's Guild or a similar trading company. This is a crucial distinction. He's not learning to make goods, like a weaver or a tanner. He's learning to buy, sell and transport them. This positions him in the highest tier of the urban economy, dealing in liquid wealth and long-distance trade. As an apprentice, his life is still demanding. He runs errands, cleans the shop, and lives under the master's roof. But his apprenticeship is different from the pre-plague norm. It is shorter, often reduced from 7 years to 5 or even less. And because you, his father, provided capital in the form of that initial small payment to the master, Thomas is treated with more respect. His education, remember his literacy and numeracy from section 11, makes him invaluable to the master, who relies on Thomas to keep the complex ledgers that track shipments of wool, the sale of fine cloth, perhaps even the green cloth for your coat, and the collection of debts. The guilds function as both protectors of quality and restrictive barriers to entry. On the one hand, they enforce strict standards of craftsmanship, ensuring that the goods Thomas sells are high quality, which protects your rural capital when you spend it. On the other hand, the guilds use their political power to fix prices, regulate wages, and limit competition, all of which serve to keep the profits high for their own members. You understand this double-edged nature perfectly. You are happy Thomas is learning to use the guild's restrictive power to your family's advantage, but you also see how they are simply replacing the oppressive feudal hierarchy with a new, equally exclusionary urban one. The guildmaster, in his rich fur-trimmed robes, is merely a different kind of baron. The quirkier tidbit of the guild system in this era is the sudden importance of female labour and widows' rights. Since so many male craftsmen died, their widows often inherited the entire shop and were legally permitted to continue operating the business as a free sister or master widow, even running the apprenticeship system. You might find that Thomas's master's wife, a keen businesswoman who survived the plague, is the true brains of the operation, giving your son a surprisingly sharp education in accounting and inventory management. This temporary post-plague rise in women's economic autonomy in the guilds was a unique, often short-lived feature of the urban recovery. Once Thomas completes his apprenticeship, he will become a journeyman, a wage-earning skilled worker who travels to gain experience. With the high urban wages, even higher than your farmhand Williams, Thomas saves money quickly. The ultimate goal, however, is to become a master. To become a master, Thomas must present a masterpiece, a demonstration of his skill, although for a draper this might be a complex ledger or a successful trade deal, and pay a hefty master's fee. This is where your rural capital, your expanded farm and your cash savings comes into play. You don't just give him the money, you invest it. You fund his master's fee and help him set up his own small drapery shop. Your farm acts as a secure bank, allowing your son to leapfrog the years of struggle that a landless journeyman would have faced. This collaboration between your rural agrarian capital and Thomas's urban mercantile skill is the key to your family's long-term stability and ascent. Your land provides security, his trade provides liquid, expanding wealth. This whole process highlights a crucial open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the post-plague urban guilds were fundamentally conservative institutions that slowed economic progress by enforcing tradition and fixing prices, or if they were necessary institutions that ensured stability, quality control, and the rapid transmission of skills in a chaotic economic landscape. For you, it is a necessary evil. The guilds protect your son's wealth, so you support them, even while acknowledging their restrictive nature. They are the gatekeepers to the next level of society, and your family is now standing inside the gate. Your family's success is now firmly rooted in two separate economies. You, the father, are the yeoman, the backbone of the land. Your son is the urban burgess or bourgeois, the architect of your family's commercial future. You have secured your land for generations, ensuring that even if the urban trade collapses, the farm remains. Thomas's success means that if the crops fail, the town income will sustain the family. This strategic diversification of wealth and risk is the ultimate expression of your successful navigation of the post-plague world. The final chapter of your story is about realizing that your prosperity is not a temporary fluke, it is a fundamental, permanent shift in status. You're no longer just survivors, you're the founders of a new, enduring class. You must now look at the long-term legacy, the establishment of a multi-generational stability that guarantees your family will never again be subject to the whims of the aristocracy or the tyranny of the soil. You stand on the threshold of your new life, looking back at the wreckage of the old world. Your journey, begun in the eerie silence of your post-plague village, has culminated in a stability your ancestors could only have dreamed of. You're no longer merely a survivor, you're a founder, the originator of a prosperous multi-generational family line that embodies the social revolution wrought by the Black Death. Your life is a testament to the power of economic opportunity over entrenched social hierarchy. You're a successful yeoman farmer, having maximised your profit by appropriating abandoned land, consolidating your strips, remember Thomas Cooper's field from Section 2, and converting burdensome feudal services into fixed cash rents, Section 10. Your family lives in a sturdy permanent home with a chimney, Section 7, eats the diet of the minor gentry, Section 8, and wears fine, practical clothing, Section 9, all achieved by cleverly navigating the price-wage spiral, Section 6. The mainstream historical fact that defines this final stage is the consolidation of the English yeoman class as a permanent, powerful fixture in the social landscape, starting in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. This new class, prosperous, freeholding or securely tenant farmers, became the economic bedrock of the kingdom, replacing the fragmented, highly dependent peasantry of the feudal system. They provided political stability and, crucially, a reliable source of taxes and rent that the aristocracy eventually learned to depend on. Your greatest strategic success was in diversifying your family's assets. Your farm provides tangible security and liquid capital, anchoring your family in the land. Simultaneously, your son Thomas, the educated clerk who is now an aspiring master in a town guild, Section 17, has successfully invested that rural capital into the urban mercantile economy. This dual presence, in the field and in the counting house, is the ultimate long-term stability plan. If the crops fail, Thomas's profits from selling fine cloth will keep the farm solvent. If the king taxes the merchants too heavily, your secure land and stored grain will keep Thomas's business afloat. You're immune to single industry shocks. The copyhold you fought so hard for, Section 10, is the legal document that guarantees this legacy. You have ensured that your family's tenure is heritable, meaning that when you pass, your land and property, less a small customary payment, will pass directly to your son without the lord being able to confiscate or renegotiate the terms harshly. This legal security fosters a long-term investment mindset. You plant trees, you drain marshland, and you make improvements that will not yield a profit for 20 years, because you know your family, not the lord, will reap the reward. This patient, capital-driven farming is a profound departure from the subsistence farming of your ancestors. The quirkier tidbit of this era is the sudden importance of legal literacy and specialised documents. The old feudal world ran on custom and oral tradition. The new yeoman world runs on written law and contracts. Your son Thomas, with his commercial education, Section 11, often returns to the village not just to visit, but to review your manorial documents, check the weight of coinage in your cash box, and draft simple wills or marriage agreements for the rest of the family. Remember the strategic marriage planning in Section 15. He's the family's first non-clerical intellectual, using his specialised knowledge to protect and multiply the wealth created by your physical labour. The tools of the ruling class, literacy and law, have become the tools of your family's defence. You also see the subtle but powerful political shift in the local structures. Baron Reginald, recognising the new reality, no longer relies on the heavy-handed, coercive bailiffs of old. Instead, he starts to appoint prosperous yeomen, men like you, or your neighbours, as reeves, the manorial official responsible for supervising tenants and organising communal work, or as constables, the local law enforcement. He co-opts your class, giving you minor official authority. This development leads to the final open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the long-term success of the yeoman class eventually solidified the existing social order by absorbing and neutralising revolutionary forces, like those seen in the 1381 Revolt, Section 13. Or if it fundamentally transformed the social order by creating a powerful, independent property class that eventually became the engine for England's later economic and political shifts. For you, as you look at your clean house and your sleeping son, it feels like a transformation. You fought the old order and won, not by destroying it, but by successfully becoming too valuable and too essential for it to function without you. Your life is the bridge between two worlds, the dying world of the serf and the dawning world of the free capitalist farmer. The plague stripped away millions of lives, but in doing so, it gifted the survivors with the single most valuable commodity, choice. You chose to work harder, invest smarter, and fight harder than the ruling class expected. The silence outside your new window is no longer the silence of the dead, but the quiet of security. You hear the distant sound of your own sheep grazing on the consolidated fields, the quiet tick of the clock in your inner chamber, a rarity you acquired from Thomas in the city, and the steady breathing of your family. You have secured a legacy that ensures your great-grandchildren will be freeholders, merchants or professionals, and will never have to ask, as the radical preacher once did, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The answer, thanks to your courage and cunning, is your family. The fire in the hearth is drawing down now, the stone walls of your homes slowly radiating the stored heat of the day. The moon casts long, pale streaks across the wooden floorboards, illuminating the documents you keep tucked safely beneath a loose plank. Your copyhold, Thomas's Guild apprenticeship contract, and the receipt for the sale of your last major wool clip. They are the artifacts of your freedom, quiet evidence that you took the chaos of the greatest calamity and forged stability from its ruins. Let the heavy weight of that long revolutionary history settle around you. The fears of the plague are distant, the conflicts of the revolt long past. You have made your family safe, secure and prosperous, transforming a century of terror into an enduring legacy of independence. The ghosts of the old world have receded, replaced by the warmth and solidity of your new reality. The ground beneath you is firm, the roof over you is sound, and the future is yours, built brick by brick, coin by coin, and with every free swing of your hoe. Let the peace of that hard-won victory lull you now. There is nothing left to fight, nothing left to worry about, only quiet.